Hello, we'll get started here in just a minute. Thanks everybody for joining. I see folks are just coming in to the webinar, so we'll get started here in just a moment. Great. Why don't we go ahead and get started? Hello, my name is Tim Daly, and I am the director of the Joyce Foundation's Gun Violence Prevention and Justice Reform Program. Thank you for joining today's discussion in our Lunch and Learn webinar series on emerging research into gun violence. For today's discussion, we're excited to be joined by a panel of experts who contributed to a new Joyce Foundation report, Optimizing Crime Gun Intelligence, to discuss the report's key findings, its recommendations, and how all of us can improve the use and adoption of key tools like eTrace. Before we dig into today's discussion, a few housekeeping items. First, today's webinar is being recorded and in the coming days will be made available on the Joyce Foundation's website. And after today's discussion, we'll be sure to share a version of the presenter's slide deck and other key materials referenced in today's webinar. Again, today's discussion will last about 1 hour, with the final 20 minutes being reserved for your questions. And to that end, if you have a question for today's speakers, please include it in the Q&A feature found at the bottom of the screen. I would encourage you to submit your questions as you think of them, even if the speakers are still presenting. So with that housekeeping aside, let's jump into today's discussion. Crime gun intelligence tools have been identified to help law enforcement disrupt the supply of crime guns, identify and apprehend offenders, and prevent future acts of gun violence. Tools like eTrace and NIBIN have increased clearance rates for gun crimes ranging from homicide to aggravated assault in cities like Milwaukee. However, the Foundation's new report, Optimizing Crime Gun Intelligence, finds significant gaps in participation and utilization of these tools at the federal, state, and local levels. To discuss this report, I'm pleased to be joined by 3 experts on the topic: Nasser Hussain and Sarah Tofty from Understory Consulting, and Captain Philip Simmert of the Milwaukee Police Department. Nasser started his career as a management consultant for Bain & Company, advising companies on strategy, marketing, and operations. After Bain, Nasser served as the senior manager for research and implementation at Everytown for Gun Safety, where he managed research projects on firearm suicide and mass shootings, and worked with city and state authorities to improve the implementation of gun safety laws. Prior to founding Understory Consulting, Sarah Tofty held senior positions at leading international and domestic NGOs. As a senior researcher at the Human Rights Watch, Sarah exposed the existence of hundreds of thousands of untested rape kits in the U.S., which became known as the Rape Kit Backlog. As the director of research at Everytown for Gun Safety, Sarah designed and oversaw the organization's research strategy. And finally, Captain Philip Simmert leads the Fusion Division at the Milwaukee Police Department, the agency he began his law enforcement career with in 2001. Over his 20-year career at the Milwaukee PD, Simmert has been assigned to key appointments, including designation as a federal task force officer for the ATF, conducting firearm investigations. In 2022, Captain Simmert was promoted to captain and took over command of the Fusion Division, which serves as the hub for MPD's intelligence gathering and analysis efforts. With those introductions aside, let's jump into today's discussion. Next slide, please. Over the next 40 minutes, we plan to cover a few topics. First, we'll cover the timeline and methodology behind this new report. Second, we'll provide more background and context, particularly as it relates to current trends in gun violence rates and clearance rates. Then, we'll offer a quick primer on what ATF's crime gun intelligence tools are exactly, before then jumping into the key findings from the Foundation's new report, Optimizing Crime Gun Intelligence. As part of that discussion, we'll spend some time digging into the report's recommendations. Finally, we'll hear from one of the experts leading this work on the ground, who will provide a case study of sorts on how Milwaukee, Wisconsin is using these tools and the impact they have had. Next slide, please. This project began in the summer of 2022. Following the terrible tragedies in Buffalo, New York, Uvalde, Texas, and an uptick in daily gun violence around the country, policymakers across the nation again took a hard look at what they could do in response. One of the key solutions that came during this period was the enactment of the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, the most significant gun safety law in nearly 3 decades. At the same time, at the state and local level, several policymakers also began exploring what executive actions they could take. Many experts at the time recommended increased focus on crime gun intelligence tools, but these recommendations were hindered by the lack of available data and up-to-date analysis on these tools, two key gaps that ultimately gave rise to this project. In response, the Joyce Foundation worked with a series of experts, including those at Understory Consulting, to start pulling this research project together. So that, I invite Nasser to give a little bit more on the methodology for today's report.
Thanks for that, Tim. So the research process in terms of primary research focused on qualitative interviews with over 30 key stakeholders connected to 20 institutions related to the crime gun intelligence ecosystem, including federal law enforcement agencies, state and local law enforcement agencies, particularly those in the Great Lakes region, researchers who have studied crime gun intelligence, and gun violence prevention advocacy organizations who have worked on the issue as well. Also, via a FOIA request, we were able to obtain new quantitative data on the eTrace collective data sharing, and NIBIN systems from ATF. And we'll go through the findings from that data in more detail in this presentation. And finally, we conducted a wide range of research on secondary sources, including ATF's own reporting on the usage and impact of crime gun intelligence tools, publicly available data on rates of gun violence and gun crime clearance rates, and media reports on crime gun intelligence approaches and individual cases in which crime gun intelligence helped move the needle in solving the case. I'll hand it back over to Tim for some table setting on why this approach is so important.
Thanks, Nasser. If you wouldn't mind going to the next slide here. Thank you. So before digging into the report itself, a little bit of context. As many of you are painfully aware, over the last 20 years, there have been more than 715,000 people in this country that have been killed with guns, including almost 420,000 by firearm suicide and over 270,000 by firearm homicide. As a result of these trends, guns now account for over 70% of all homicide deaths in the United States. Next slide, please. But gun homicides are especially difficult for law enforcement to solve. That's for several reasons, including that the use of a gun allows for physical distance between the perpetrator and victim, which reduces the likelihood that genetic evidence is left behind or that the crime is clearly witnessed, among other factors. In an analysis of murder clearance rates from over 200 cities across the country, the Trace recently found that only 46% of murders committed with firearms were considered cleared, compared to 75% of murders committed with other weapons. Furthermore, the clearance rate for firearm murders is going down, while the clearance rate for non-firearm murders is going up. So taking all of this information together, this tells us that America is facing a gun violence crisis, in part because we are facing a clearance rates crisis. With less than half of all gun homicides in America being solved, police community trust is being eroded, violent individuals remain free, and retaliatory violence becomes more likely in the absence of legal accountability, creating a vicious cycle that we believe perpetuates further violence. Next slide, please. With this context, I'm pleased to turn over the floor to Sarah Tofty to give a primer on some of the tools available to solve some of these gun crimes in particular.
Thanks, Tim. So before we dig in further, we want to explain what the phrase crime gun intelligence means. Over the past 25 years, ATF has made available a suite of tech-driven tools to law enforcement agencies around the country. These tools support the investigation of gun crimes, allowing law enforcement to trace the origins of crime guns, identify linkages between shootings, and integrate that information across agencies. This suite of tools is collectively referred to as ATF's crime gun intelligence. When a gun is used in a crime, there are at least 3 possible pieces of evidence that can be collected and analyzed using ATF's crime gun intelligence tools. The first is the gun itself. This is where eTrace and eTrace's collective data sharing, CDS, come in. eTrace allows law enforcement to trace the origins of crime guns, including which dealer first sold the gun and what individual first purchased the gun. eTrace's collective data sharing function allows law enforcement to share eTrace data across jurisdictions, enabling mapping of crime gun flow patterns that may lead to the identification of straw purchasers or traffickers. If a gun is fired in the commission of a crime, there may be a ballistic evidence in the form of bullets and shell casings. These are the second and third types of evidence that can be analyzed using ATF's crime gun intelligence tools. The National Integrated Ballistic Information Network, or NIBIN, allows law enforcement to connect shooting incidents via ballistic evidence, identifying the most active guns within a particular jurisdiction, and developing key investigative leads. And the NIBIN Enforcement Support System, or NES, synthesizes information from NIBIN, eTrace, and a police department's RMS system into a single map-based platform.
So with that context, I will present some of the key findings from the report, Optimizing Crime Gun Intelligence. So first off, on eTrace. eTrace is hosted by ATF, as Sarah said, and it's an internet-based platform that allows law enforcement users to trace the origins of recovered crime guns. Before the advent of eTrace, law enforcement could only submit trace requests to ETF by phone, mail, or fax. So ATF was launched in 2005, and as you can see in this chart here, its usage has grown steadily year by year through 2024. As of January 2024, about 9,700 law enforcement agencies in the country are using eTrace, which represents more than 50% of all law enforcement agencies in the country. eTrace is ATF's preferred method of receiving trace requests. It streamlines the gun trace process and makes it easier and faster for law enforcement agencies to request traces and to receive trace reports compared to those older, more cumbersome methods like mail, fax, or phone. eTrace also improves the quality of trace data because when you're submitting a trace request via eTrace, there's real-time data validation that helps prevent incorrect entries from being submitted. Even though eTrace participation has grown, there remains significant gap towards full participation. There's still approximately 50% of law enforcement agencies in the country that are not signed up to participate in eTrace. And those rates of participation vary widely by state. So in some states like New Jersey, you have almost 100% of law enforcement agencies participating in eTrace. And in states like South Dakota, that number is 20%. And you can see here, there's all the shades in between here. There's a wide variance in eTrace participation rates by state. Which is indicative of the role that state policymakers and law enforcement officials have to play. When you look at the top 3 states by eTrace participation rate here, New Jersey, Virginia, and North Carolina, these are all states that have laws requiring law enforcement agencies to trace all recovered crime guns. And New Jersey goes even further than that and specifies that tracing be conducted via eTrace. When we spoke to law enforcement about some of the challenges with eTrace, the main problem that rose to the surface was slow processing times. So the average trace request now takes approximately 16 days to complete, according to ATF data, which is much slower than ATF's stated goal of 7 days for completion of a standard trace request and 48 hours for completion of an urgent trace request. One law enforcement interviewee we spoke with said there's no rhyme or reason to how long it takes to get an eTrace back. Sometimes it takes hours, sometimes it takes weeks. And that unpredictability, and especially when it takes a very long time, can sort of blunt the investigative value of the eTrace system. And a key reason why the trace process is so time and labor intensive is because ATF is not allowed to maintain searchable, digitized records of firearm sales and transfers. Nearly 40 years ago, Congress enacted a law called the Firearms Protection Act that prohibited ATF from using any system of registration, quote unquote, of firearms, firearm owners, or firearm sales. And since then, Congress has used riders in spending bills to prohibit ATF from, quote, consolidation or centralization of firearm purchase and sales records. And effectively, this has prevented ATF from keeping a digitized, searchable database of gun sales records. Now, within this antiquated system in which ATF has to manually search through purchase and sale records, they are further hampered by a lack of resources. So you can see here in this slide, the blue line refers to trace volume. So between 2005 and 2020, I believe this is 2021 in this slide, traces requested more than doubled. And over that same period of time, the budget of the National Tracing Center, which is the unit within ATF that's responsible for conducting traces, has gone down by 14% in inflation-adjusted real dollars. So ATF is being asked to do more with less, which has contributed to the delays in processing for e-trace requests. The other obstacle we heard about is a lack of data beyond the first retail purchase. So as Sarah mentioned, an e-trace report gives you that first retail purchaser, but for many crime guns, the gun has changed hands multiple times between that first retail purchase and its eventual usage in a crime. So we heard from one law enforcement investigator who said, for the majority of guns we trace, the time to crime is over 1,000 days. When you don't track every firearm transaction after the first legal purchase, it limits the usefulness of that information. So transitioning to E-Trace's collective data sharing function, just to remind you all, this is what allows agencies to share E-Trace data between agencies within the same state. So this is key to creating these macro level platforms that identify crime gun flows. Two examples of these platforms in the Great Lakes states are Illinois' Crime Gun Connect and Pennsylvania's Track and Trace platform. These are platforms built using CDS data that allow law enforcement to identify patterns in the flows of crime guns that could lead to the identification of straw purchasers and traffickers. For example, you can see in the bottom left of this slide a screenshot from Illinois' Crime Gun Connect, which shows 9 crime gun recoveries in the city of Chicago that are all connected to the same first retail purchaser in Indianapolis. And this is strongly indicative of a straw purchaser or trafficker. These platforms also present macro level trends, spotlighting, the number of crime gun recoveries in a state, the states that are the sources of those crime guns, and the types of guns used in crime. So for example, Illinois Crime Gun Connect was able to identify an increase in ghost guns showing up in crimes, which contributed to the advancement of policies to restrict the access to ghost guns in Illinois. Now, key to the impact of these platforms is CDS participation. You need agencies to participate in CDS, collective data sharing, in order for that data to be put into this shared pool and to be made available at the state level. And as you can see here, there are huge variances in CDS participation by state. You have a state, again, like New Jersey, where the participation rate is almost 100%. And you have a state like Michigan where that participation rate is 10%. And I should clarify here, when I say participation rates here, this refers to the percentage of E-Trace participating agencies that are also participating in CDS. So in Michigan, for example, the 10% number means that 10% of agencies who are enrolled in E-Trace are also sharing their data via collective data sharing. And you can see there's a lot of variance between states here, but the participation rates tend to be fairly low. In the majority of states, fewer than 25% of E-Trace participants are also participating in CDS. And that limits the amount of data that makes it into these shared platforms and contributes to the identification of straw purchasers and traffickers. Again, state policy has a role to play here. We also heard that awareness is a key driver of lagging participation. We talked to a staffer at a state AG's office who said that sometimes when you see police departments not signed up for CDS, you just have to give them a call, explain what it is, tell them how easy it is to sign up, and that they haven't run into much resistance. And on the state policy side of things, again, there's a role for state policymakers here. New Jersey, which has the highest CDS participation rate, part of the reason for that is that the Attorney General in 2018 issued a directive mandating that all law enforcement agencies both trace guns via E-Trace and opt in to CDS. Transitioning to NIBIN here, again, NIBIN is what allows law enforcement to connect shooting scenes via ballistic evidence. There's been significant growth in the amount of ballistic evidence entered into NIBIN over the past several years. Between 2017 and 2022, the amount of ballistic evidence entered into NIBIN more than doubled. Despite that growth, we know that we still don't have comprehensive evidence entry into NIBIN. For example, there was some reporting in 2018 focusing on California that found that only 25% of collected shell casings were entered into NIBIN. Now, NIBIN has become more useful as the number of entries have increased. The more evidence is entered into NIBIN, the more able the system is to generate leads, identifying connections between different shooting scenes. The ability of NIBIN to generate leads has increased as the amount of evidence entered has increased. But the gaps indicate that there is still room to grow and to further improve the lead generation capacity of NIBIN. Again, similar to E-Trace, when we asked about what the main barriers or obstacles were for NIBIN, again, we heard slow processing times was an issue. This slide breaks down the average processing time from the time that evidence is entered to the time that the lead is generated by NIBIN site. So what this shows is that 65% of NIBIN sites in January to June of 2023 had processing times of less than 48 hours. Those are the blue segments here of the bar. That meets ATF's minimum standards for NIBIN processing times. But the flip side of that is that 35% of NIBIN sites had an average processing time of greater than 48 hours, so they were failing to meet that standard. And some of them had very long processing times of more than 8 weeks. Part of the reason for these slow processing times is a need for expanded NIBIN capacity. There are currently about 300 NIBIN sites in the US compared to over 18,000 police departments. There's 6 states, albeit smaller states, that don't have any NIBIN machines at all as of June 2023. And across the board, we heard that more NIBIN machines and more NIBIN technicians would allow for more comprehensive evidence entry and faster processing. And as Tim mentioned earlier, NIBIN has been shown to improve clearance rates for gun crime. So, expanding this capacity, creating more comprehensive evidence entry and faster processing is really key to achieving maximal impact here. Finally, NESS. NESS is designed to bring together data from these systems. So the E-Trace and the NIBIN systems are somewhat siloed. NESS is designed to solve that problem by merging E-Trace and NIBIN data, as well as data from the police department's own records management system, providing law enforcement with the most crime gun intelligence information in one place as possible. Now, the main barrier to NESS is again, sort of a lack of participation, a lack of awareness. As of March 2024, only about 300 law enforcement agencies are signed up for NESS, so it's really in its nascency. And what we heard is that part of the reason for that is that it takes a long time to get set up with the NESS system, to get fully set up with the NESS system. So building that data bridge between your police department's records management system and the NESS system requires a dedicated IT professional. It takes a lot of time and resources, again, which is part of the reason why there's such relatively low participation as of now. Finally, just want to nod to the Crime Gun Intelligence Center concept. I know Captain Simmer can speak to this in even more detail, but Crime Gun Intelligence Centers are designed to integrate and apply these crime gun intelligence tools. They are place-based collaborations between ATF, local police departments, prosecutors, et cetera. Currently, there are 54 Crime Gun Intelligence Center sites nationwide. What we heard from experts is that implementation is not always consistent between these sites, and that there's an appetite for more of them. So, in terms of where we go from here, the model has proven to be effective in places where implementation has been effective. And there's an appetite for more CJICs, including regional CJICs that would serve groups of smaller towns that may not have enough population or enough gun crime for an individual CJIC, but could benefit from the model greatly. And with that, I'll hand it over to my colleague, Sarah, to talk through some of the recommendations.
Yeah, so our recommendations here are designed to maximize the impact of ATF's crime gun intelligence tools, including improvements to the tools themselves, ways to drive increased law enforcement use of the tools, evaluation of their impact, and the provision of the right resources required to ensure comprehensive and effective implementation. Starting with integration, ATF should integrate all eTrace and NIBIN data nationwide, possibly VNS, and allow all law enforcement agencies who participate in eTrace, CDS, and NIBIN to access the platform. Timeliness is key, and ATF should reduce its turnaround times for eTrace so that results are turned around within at least 7 days, and NIBIN leads are generated within 48 hours. Barriers need to be reduced so that ATF can create a digitized, searchable database for gun sale and transfer records, and state and federal policymakers should mandate the recording of all firearm transfers beyond the first retail purchase. Moving to the next slide, in order for crime gun intelligence tools to achieve their maximum impact, state and local law enforcement agencies must participate in and use these tools comprehensively. This will require ATF to create a liaison office and technical support function to increase awareness of and facilitate the participation in crime gun intelligence tools. State and local law enforcement agencies should sign up to participate in eTrace, CDS, NIBIN, and NES, and have departmental policies that mandate that all recovered crime guns be traced via eTrace and all recovered ballistic evidence be submitted into NIBIN. State law enforcement should support training for local law enforcement on how to use ATF's crime gun intelligence tools, and state policymakers should mandate that all in-state law enforcement agencies enroll in and comprehensively use eTrace, CDS, and NIBIN. Moving to the next slide, additional research and evaluation is required to understand the impact of ATF's crime gun intelligence tools and assess capacity needs and improvements. This should come from more NIJ funding for evaluations, ATF assessments on capacity and technology needs, and state policymakers should assess their own technology and capacity needs and the resources required to meet them. Next slide. And last, but certainly not least, expanding the usage of crime gun intelligence tools is going to require a significant investment of additional resources. So this can happen with ATF allocating discretionary funds and request additional budget that's required to improve their processing times, that's needed to create an integrated national platform for crime gun intelligence data, and provides NES access to more agencies. Federal policymakers should increase ATF's budget to support the recommended improvements and earmark federal law enforcement grants to go towards state and local agencies' use of crime gun intelligence tools, and expand the CJIC initiative to new cities. And state and local policymakers should provide funding for the creation of state-level crime gun analytics platforms, outreach and awareness campaigns to drive increased usage of crime gun intelligence tools, new NIBIN terminals in strategic locations, and the creation and ongoing operation of CJICs. And now I'll turn it over to Tim and Nasser.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. And just very quickly, I know there was one question in the chat about how you can get information about where, if folks are signed up for these tools or not. On the Joyce Foundation website, which a screenshot you can see here, the database that was collected through our FOIA request to ATF is available both for complete download or search through this database. So I would encourage those folks who have questions about particular agencies by state, if they are participating in eTrace or collective data sharing, to be able to just go to this website to take a look. So with that, we're going to turn the floor over to Captain Simmert from Milwaukee Police Department to hear his perspective on how they've been using these tools and his views on them. So Captain Simmert, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. So the Milwaukee Police Department started up our CJIC in 2014, and we saw immediate success in terms of lowering clearance rates. In 2013, for non-fatal shootings, we started at 23%, and by 2017, that clearance rate increased to 36%. For those cases that there was no leads through NIBIN, that clearance rate stayed at about 24%. So this has been a game changer for us. I'll talk about eTrace first. eTrace basically looks at the life of the gun, right? From importer to the gun shop that made the sale of the firearm. This is kind of how we find straw purchases. I think we average somewhere between 20 to 35 straw purchases a year. And at the end of the day, our goal is to reduce violence within our city. And this is one way that we can do it, because oftentimes these straw purchasers aren't buying just one firearm for a prohibited person. They're purchasing many. In fact, about 2 weeks ago, I believe, we identified someone who had purchased 30 guns that had all appeared in various crimes. NIBIN itself has greatly helped us. It's important to point out that it provides investigative leads, but those leads are strong. When you bring eTrace with NIBIN, it starts to paint a more perfect picture through, data analysis. You could link, you don't have a suspect in a shooting, you have nothing to work with. Well, all of a sudden there's NIBIN hits or a firearm is recovered and you do a test fire. Well, now you have a name to work with. Now you go back to that original eTrace and you make connections showing that, oh, that's a cousin of this person or they're friends. Aside from clearances, if you can't clear a shooting, it's still a good investigative tool because it shows who your trigger pullers are. If you don't have enough to get a case prosecuted in court, you've identified a person who is driving your violence within your community, and you can focus your attention on them through a drug investigation or find previous other criminal investigations where some follow-up can get it across the plate. If they're serving that prison sentence, they're not out on the street contributing to the violent rates. To give some perspective, and I know it was discussed during the initial deck, it is quantity in, quantity out. So in the year 2022, we had a total of 11,222 casing and test fire entries. From that, it turned into 4,903 leads. Through the first 6 months of this year, we're at 2,712, which is an 18% increase compared to the previous year. So the more that we're putting in, the greater number of leads that we're coming up with. The Milwaukee Police Department is unique in that we have a full-time staff that's dedicated to NIBIN. It's a 24/7 operation. We have 7 NIBIN techs, 1 civilian forensic ballistics specialist, 2 ATF civilian contractors, and then 4 detectives. So we'll do the test fires, and then as we get the correlations, we will have someone that sits down and they triage those cases. So they'll take, I'll make an example of, there's 6 incidents that are related via ballistics. They'll put brief notes in there, and then we'll hand those off to detectives to work the leads until there's nothing left. Through the years, we've changed some of our practices here to make things more efficient. When they talk about turnaround within 48 hours, for the most part, every so often we'll run into a capacity issue, but we typically meet that. If we have a person in custody with a firearm, that firearm is put to the front of the batch. We'll swab it for DNA, we'll test fire it, and typically we'll have results of if there are leads to that firearm within just a couple of hours. And that's important because we already have that person in custody. So that's the best opportunity to discuss all of those cases that are connected via ballistic evidence. I do believe that between eTrace and our use of the NIBIN system, it has improved our clearances. I think for non-fatal shootings, we hover, around 40–45%. And then homicides could be anywhere from 67 to 80%, which is much higher than if we did not have that technology. I believe that should cover it.
Fantastic. Thank you, Captain Simmert, for that. We now have a bunch of time for questions to dig a little bit deeper on some of the things that we talked about. So if you do have a question, please feel free to put it in the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. And for Captain Simmert, Nasser, and Sarah, I'd invite you all to come back onto the screen here, and we can jump into a discussion here on some of the questions that we have. The first question, which came in early on, which I think is an important clarifying question, is what is meant by clearance, as in clearance rate? Could one of you just describe what the clearance rate is?
So for the Milwaukee Police Department, homicides and non-fatal shootings are a little different. For a homicide to be cleared, the case actually has to be charged. For non-fatal shootings, a clearance is tracked via arrest that's made.
Great. Nasser, Sarah, anything you want to add to that?
No, I think that sums it up. I think perhaps different agencies may do it slightly differently, but it's at a high level, it's a proxy for how frequently cases are being solved.
Great, thank you. So let's jump into some of the other questions we have here. It says the recommendations of the report are a lot of which are for greater efforts by ATF and increased funding for the agency. But for future appropriations rounds, including the one that's Congress is discussing right now, there are a number of proposed cuts to ATF funding and include a number of policy riders that continue to restrain the agency's abilities to take actions here. How do you reconcile the recommendations with this unfortunate reality? Nasser or Sarah, do you want to start there?
Yeah, I think when we were crafting our recommendations, we were very much thinking of it from a point of view of what should happen to optimize the effectiveness of these tools, and thinking a little bit less from the point of view of what may realistically happen in the near future. I mean, I think the trend has been, unfortunately, as that chart that I showed, lower and lower levels of resourcing for ATF, even as the problem of gun crime and clearance rates gets more and more severe. So, I think our hope in crafting, in putting out this report and in the way we crafted the recommendations, is to show how significant the problem is and to really speak clearly about what the need is, and to the greatest extent possible to put some numbers behind that. And to show that there's been a real disconnect, I guess, between the funding levels that ATF has received and the problem that they're facing and what they're being tasked with.
And I would add to that, Nasser, the recommendations are not exclusive to ATF. A number of the funding recommendations or otherwise are also attributable to some other federal agencies. And there's also a state and local component of this too. So the Department of Justice, for example, through its Office of Justice Programs, is funding efforts in communities to create these CJICs, for example. They just funded the creation of the CJIC here in Chicago. And that's an OJP grant, not an ATF grant. So there are other funding streams available, number one. But number two, even if the federal policymakers are not able to fund or support these programs, there's a role for state and local policymakers too. And in the report, we went into one example where in Ohio, the governor and attorney general there decided to use some of their state resources to procure NIBIN machines to close some of their information gaps in the state. So even though we lifted up in our limited time together some of the recommendations as related to ATF, there are other recommendations that are, I think, as impactful lower down the chain as well. So let's jump into the next question, which is what made Milwaukee then invest so well in NIBIN and eTrace? Was it just a decision made by particular officials who knew about them and thought they might really be helpful? Or what was the thought process there, Captain Simmer?
Well, for starters, we have a really good relationship with our local branch of the ATF. The opportunity came around in 2014. The biggest challenge with any program is funding. So we were fortunate enough to have that initial funding to get us some grant money to get the machine. We did purchase a second machine with our own funds because we saw that there was value in it and to be able to increase our capacity. And then recently, the state of Wisconsin, they've provided some grant money to our department, and they expressed interest in expanding NIBIN program throughout the state to other jurisdictions.
Great, thank you. Another person asked, and this is for the whole panel, is a lot of the barriers that were discussed seem like they're somewhat political at both the state and federal levels, but it looks primarily federal, they say. What strategies and leverage points are available to reduce these barriers to participation?
I would agree that perhaps some are political. I would also say some are just simply awareness and just awareness and spreading the word. So I think we were heartened by some of what we heard from states like Pennsylvania and Illinois, where the AG's offices had made more of a concerted effort to drive up CDS participation because they were trying to create these state level tracing platforms that pool eTrace information. And I think what we heard across the board there was that there wasn't really resistance to participation on the part of police departments. It was more a lack of awareness about what collective data sharing was, how relatively easy it was to opt in. And that when they were able to kind of make that case, there was significant impact there. When you have a state like New Jersey that was more proactive at the policymaker level, in terms of one, mandating that all crime guns be traced, and two, mandating that tracing be done via eTrace, and then three, via the AG's directive, mandating that all agencies enroll in collective data sharing. Perhaps there's a bit more political will required there. But one, I would say there are more states than just New Jersey where I think that political will would be there to do those things that we can make progress on. And then also in states perhaps where there's still a bit of lack of political will, I think just increasing awareness would make a huge impact on terms of participation rates. I don't know if Sarah, Tim, or Captain Simmer, you would have anything to add there from your experience.
No, the only, go ahead, sorry.
Please, you first.
The only thing I would add is that DOJ does provide grants for organizations to start a CJIC as well as expand their CJIC. So it's important to look for those opportunities, to create your own success.
Yeah, and I guess I would just reiterate that in all of our interviews and conversation with law enforcement, politics wasn't something that ever really came up in terms of pressing forward on some of these initiatives. And in fact, I think what was key was having a law enforcement champion at the state and local level, whether that was at the AG's office on the state level, the governor's office, or in individual departments that really believe in these tools and this technology and know that maximizing participation is key and can sort of spread the word. So we've seen, in states that have worked to expand NIBIN terminals, that's happened under both sort of Democratic administrations and also Republican administrations. So I think on this particular issue, you just need to find some real true believers in the value of this technology, primarily in the law enforcement community, and get them to serve as champions for this issue.
Thanks everybody for that. So if the barrier is awareness, one person asks, well, what about just investing in law enforcement education? Is that something that is already underway, or are people doing that either federally or in states? And I'll open that to anybody on the panel.
So a couple things here. One, I think federally, at least from ATF, the position that they took in when we asked them about this in terms of what role they play in driving awareness is that they don't really see that as their responsibility or purview. They said, we make these tools available, but we don't necessarily do anything to drive participation or encourage participation in these tools. I think at the state level, there are several examples of states offering training. So in the New Jersey example I mentioned, where there was a directive that agencies participate in CDS, New Jersey State Police was then offered as a technical resource for agencies who, were navigating the process of signing up and enrolling in CDS. In terms of broader training, it's not something that I have heard about, but it is something that's reflected in our recommendations that be expanded and that state law enforcement in particular play a role in training local law enforcement on how to use not just E-Trace and CDS, but all of these tools and how to optimize a crime gun intelligence approach. But Captain Simard, I don't know if that's something that you have any experience with in your jurisdiction in terms of training on these tools.
Not so much training. I think a lot of this, from a law enforcement standpoint, it's word of mouth. In our particular state, the crime lab had 2 machines. They ultimately did away with those machines due to their own capacity. We would handle entering casings for outside jurisdictions, and eventually those jurisdictions, there'd be a waiting time. So then they would explore through the ATF how they could create their own system. And as a result of that, I know in my time here, there's at least 3 larger cities that now have their own standalone programs. And that just kind of spreads its way throughout the state. Milwaukee can handle these many counties, Green Bay can handle these many counties, Racine, the same thing. So I think a lot of it is word of mouth and really championing the program and how it can benefit a particular agency. Since I've been here, our leadership has bought into the program, so that's also very helpful.
And to tie this back to one of the first questions that we asked, which was, a lot of these recommendations that were discussed, mention, federal resources for the ATF, which is a bit of an uphill climb, it seems, in Congress. I think this is a perfect example of where, in an ideal state, as you said, Nasser, Congress and federal policymakers would fund ATF to be able to do the type of outreach that I think we've been describing here. But we're not in that ideal state, and the ATF has been given a bit of a bad hand in their ability to do that. Instead, I think that provides an opportunity for state and local law enforcement to serve in those roles. And as you illuminated, Nasser, where the Illinois Attorney General's office in particular has gone department by department to try and recruit individual partners to join them in these tools. And although that may not be the optimal scenario, it is certainly a viable scenario to increase participation. We have another question then back to the Milwaukee Police Department. They ask, can you just restate how many folks work in the NIBIN unit again, Captain Simmer?
So we have one sergeant that oversees 7 sworn NIBIN techs. We have 1 civilian forensic ballistic specialist, 2 ATF contract employees, 4 detectives, and then 1 crime analyst that kind of pulls the data together.
Thank you. Another person asks, I love the idea of engaging our Attorney General to mandate participation. There may be a little bit of a place for a little research on their part, but wondering if there's any legal barriers to such a mandate. In particular, does the AG have the authority to mandate local jurisdictions to participate? Nasser or Sarah, I don't know if this came up in some of the research that we did.
It's a great question. It's not anything we heard about as a barrier. But I don't know the extent to which attorney generals have tried to do that outside New Jersey, which again is the only place I know of that directive existing.
Okay. Then another person from Washington State asks, we're in the throes of a juvenile gun violence epidemic in Seattle. How do all these great trace and identification processes apply to minors using guns? Any legal barriers? Captain Simmert, I wonder if you might want to take a crack at that first.
So we have that very same issue here in the city of Milwaukee. So from an investigative standpoint, it's the same as an adult investigation. The challenges are what your respective state's policies are with juvenile offenders. You know, will they hold juvenile offenders? Can they get waived into adult court? Certainly on the federal side, you know, they won't go near a case unless the person's 18. But that's a challenge across all crime types.
Great, thank you for that. Another person asked, when E-Trace is used to identify a suspected straw purchaser, who else is given a heads up about that data? ATF, U.S. attorneys? Are the firearm dealers themselves ever told about what was found? Captain Simmer, do you want to start? And then Nasser and Sarah, anything to add?
So we wouldn't share that too openly. Investigators would go to a firearm dealer to try to get video to show what that looked like. You know, you could see straw purchasers with someone and that person is pointing to firearms. They're not touching it themselves, but they're directing it. We do share it with the ATF because they will actually do the larger straw purchase cases as part of our NIBIN CJIC group. And as far as will involve the U.S. attorney once, you know, the case is put together fully. Traditionally, they like to do multiple straw purchases rather than just a one-off.
Thank you for that, Sarah or Nasser.
Yeah, I might just add to, I think this is a value of a CJIC system too. I think partly what makes, there's many great things about CJICs, but it is this coordination, extra level of coordination, I think, between local law enforcement and ATF that I think makes it even more likely that both they're in sort of conversation or working together through an investigation. And it makes sort of the role sort of seamless between whatever, the investigation and accountability looks like at a local level, and then passing along and moving along a case at the federal level. So I think that is exactly what CJICs are meant to do, is sort of increase that kind of coordination and collaboration. So you have accountability happening sort of at all levels.
And that's a great point, Sarah. We do hold weekly meetings where all those parties are in the same room. And we talk strategies of, you know, who's best suited to work a certain angle of a case. Yeah, so that's very true.
Nasser, were you going to jump in there?
I was just going to add that in terms of sort of a scale and scope here, ATF put out a report on trafficking investigations. And I know Captain Simmer gave kind of the number of straw purchasing and trafficking investigations or cases that they typically make nationwide. Use of E-Trace and CDS has contributed to nearly 5,000 firearm trafficking investigations being referred for federal or state prosecution between 2017 and 2021. And I think there's so that's obviously, you know, that's significant. And I think there's room to grow that even more with increased usage of these tools and identification of the patterns that these tools reveal.
Okay, we only have time for just a few more questions here. But for all the information that we were talking about, someone asked, well, how long is that information kept for? I don't know if any of you can speak to what happens with the information and how long it's kept.
So I believe the tracing data has to be kept forever. I think it's in West Virginia. They have Connex storage containers that are filled with records, which is where some of that tracing information, that's where some of the delay comes from is, you know, it's not necessarily archived electronically. They have to physically go through. If a gun dealership was closed, they would have to go through those records individually.
Yeah, and same for NIBIN. You know, the NIBIN system is not like purging any records. As records are added, it's just additive. So as more evidence is entered, that's why the system becomes more effective at generating leads. It accumulates over time, and you're able to form more of those connections based on having more raw data in the system. Tim, I
I'm
think you
on
might
mute.
be
I
on mute.
apologize. Someone asked Captain Simmert if you could repeat the statistics you mentioned at the end of your discussion. 40% of clearance rates for non-fatal shootings. Can you just restate again the effect of the usage of these tools?
So when we first started the NIBIN program or CJIC program, our non-fatal shooting clearance was 23%. By 2017, that was up to 36%. And right now we hover in the 40% for non-fatal, and then homicides 67 to 80%.
Thank you for that. Another asks, are there resources available to make the case for increasing the use of these tools that could be shared with local law makers and policy department or police departments to petition for their increased use? Nasser, Sarah, do you want to start with that?
I mean, I guess I in a biased way, I would point to this report as one tool. It's a long one for sure, but it definitely has a lot of illustrations of the value of these tools, including investigative examples of how they have borne fruit in terms of identifying straw purchasers and traffickers, identifying shooters in several cases. ATF themselves also has kind of one-pagers on each of these tools that are cited to in our report that are helpful, kind of quicker primers on, you know, the value of these tools, what they do, how to sign up. Yeah, those are I think the main resources that come to mind. But I think your question sort of speaks to a broader need for materials that raise awareness about these tools in, you know, a digestible way that are quickly referenced and actionable on the part of law enforcement.
Yeah, I agree. I think the report is a great resource. We also can make available a high-level summary of the report that I think could also be a few page takeaway that can be used for that purpose. And then, as referenced during the presentation itself, some of the data that is up on the Joyce Foundation's website with this report allows you to actually see which agencies are doing what as it relates to E-Trace and collective data sharing, which again, I think are important data points in those conversations. Captain Simmert, you want the last word on this before we wrap up?
I think if you reference the report, if you look at the citations at the bottom, if you click on a couple of those reports, you start getting in the weeds. And I think you'll find some pretty good resources, or at least people that you could reach out to if you are looking to implement this in your agencies.
All right, well, fantastic. I know we didn't get to all the questions, but I'm happy that we were able to get to a number of them. And so thank you for joining us today, and to our panelists for contributing their time and expertise. As we said at the top, today's webinar was recorded and will be made available on our website in the coming days. In addition, we'll be sure to send around the slides and some of the other key materials that we referenced in today's webinar to the email address that you used to register for today's discussion. And then finally, a note about our future editions of the Joyce Foundation's Lunch and Learn webinar series. We have a number of events coming up starting in September, so please be on the lookout for additional information in the coming weeks. Again, thanks to all of our speakers and to all of you for joining us today. Have a great day wherever you may be. Thanks so much.